Hello, this is Fred Smith. I am the professor of public theology at Houston Graduate School of Theology, and I direct the Center for Leadership in Public Theology. And as you know, we've been talking about health, faith and health, especially health equity. And I've met Dr. Kimberly Parker of
Hi.
UT Women's Hospital?
University.
University. Excuse me, not too long ago. And she interviewed me, so I get a chance to turn the table on her today. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Well, you're welcome. Say more about your institution, how you got started.
Sure.
Just tell me about yourself. I don't know, it's my first time I'm really meeting you. So tell me
No
about
problem.
yourself.
So I'm an associate professor at Texas Women's University in Denton. And there is a campus in Houston, so they have three campuses total. But I teach in our health studies department. And so my background is in public health.
Okay.
And I guess the lack of a better way of putting it, I got into it, I was a psych major.
A psych major.
Yes.
Where'd you do your undergraduate?
I did my undergraduate at, in my opinion, one of the best HBCUs on the planet, South Carolina State University.
Okay.
And then afterwards, I stayed there and got a degree in counseling.
Okay.
And my goal was to be a child, adolescent psychologist or counselor or what have you, and realized two very important things. I'm not real good with children. I love other people's children.
So you do have children of your own?
No, I don't.
That was a
yes.
question.
And it's the concept of, I love on them for a couple hours, and then I'm like, where is your mother? Of course, I'm joking, but
We'll say that.
Yes, I'm joking. However, working with individuals one-on-one, the issue I had was I would work with them in these isolated situations, but then I would send you back into the same environment that in essence reinforced the condition that you were either in or dealing with. And after that, decided to go into the field of public health.
Okay.
And so went to the University of South Carolina for my master's in public health, and then got my PhD.
You just decided to go into public health? Was there anybody that influenced you?
No. Well, I think that in the conditions and wanting to do what made me happy, and I think that I had that professional student thing down pat. So, of course, when I told my parents, they were like, we need you to get a job, a real job, and pick a career. But of course, they were very supportive.
Right.
And so my master's from the University of South Carolina, and then I got my PhD from the University of Georgia in their public health program.
Okay. So you're in Texas now.
I am in
How
Texas.
How did you get here?
So I lived in Atlanta at the time. And after finishing the doctoral program, my concern was getting a job in that particular city. So, I mean, trust me, I really wanted to stay in Georgia.
Well, I went to school in Emory, so I got my PhD in, all that. So I loved Atlanta too, so I understand what you're talking about. But they got the CDC, the American Cancer Society. That's really the public health capital.
Yes, it is. And that's why I wanted to stay. I felt like that would be the perfect place to be able to do work. But as the public health capital, you had a lot of people coming in.
Yes.
And the competition for jobs was pretty stiff. So, got some advice from people and decided to leave Atlanta, build, diverse portfolio, diverse experience, and then go back in 3 years.
Okay.
And a funny thing happened on the way to life.
What happened?
I worked on a research project based out of Emory, which allowed me to go back and forth and travel for 3 years. And mentally, it felt like year one of those 3 years started when that project ended. And so year 6, which in my mind was year 3, they were like, oh yeah, by the way, your tenure packet is due next year. And then after I counted and carried the one, I was like, I have been here for 6 years. And so I'm still here 10 years later.
How are you enjoying Texas? How is Texas to you?
Texas is different. It's similar to Atlanta, the diversity, the richness in culture. Of course, different culture, but it's very similar to Atlanta. It was kind of difficult learning a new state, the older you get. So, and
I don't know about that,
yeah.
You're not that old.
I appreciate it, and I miss my heels. I miss my heels and the scenery. But in the long run, that wasn't enough to say,
Okay.
you know, I'm leaving, I'm going back home.
Well, professionally, I mean, the challenges. Tell me about your work, what you're doing, and why are you doing it?
Sure. So it's funny. I used to tell people the easiest way to describe what I do is that I do HIV behavioral research.
Okay. Yes,
Where-
I understand that, yeah.
In essence, I started out by doing research that looked at the value that people place on sexual experiences that dictates whether or not they will use protection. It just so happens that the outcome, you know, that I chose to look at was HIV and AIDS. And over time, what I noticed was, so I've done research where I've interviewed HIV positive women to get their stories and their experience, where I simply just asked 2 questions. Tell me about how you found out you were HIV positive, and then what has your life been like ever since? And people can talk for hours, you know, based on that. And I've also done research where I've collected HIV risk assessment data across the Deep South, just to look at similarities in how we view risk and how people, you know, perceive their actual risk for certain factors. And it wasn't until I started working on a PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis grant, which basically is the pill to prevent HIV, or right now, Truvada for PrEP, which has been FDA approved. I noticed that people were telling the same stories. And what placed a person at risk for HIV and AIDS placed them at risk for several other health factors. And if we take a step back, what I noticed was people who either were minority or members of minority groups or marginalized groups, a lot of what placed them at risk was beyond their control.
Well, such as?
Okay, so
Let's know
such
about
as, for instance, if we look at gender, on average, women earn less than men. And also, on average, women tend to bear the burden of a second place standing in society. They are also more likely to work or fulfill duties that come along with unearned pay.
Well, speak plainly.
So if we look at the aspect of household management, cooking,
Okay.
caring for children,
Okay.
a lot of that tends to fall on
Right.
women.
Right.
So you are earning less than men. And then you are working jobs that tend to not have, or you're completing duties, I should say, that tend to not have pay attached to them.
Okay.
And in essence, you know, the deck is stacked against you based on where you start off in the standings in society, because by default, men are the norm.
Okay. So how does that, I still don't get the connection. Make it plain. Make
Sure.
it plain. Why? So I'm a housewife, you know, or a domestic. My mother was a domestic, you know, and a housewife helped raise, 7 kids, you know. Father worked in the Canada. I'm sure he made more money and so forth. You know, and my sister, you know, and so forth. Well, they're more educated, but still, you know, the balance of that. How does that impact having unprotected sex?
Gotcha. Okay, so making it to that connection.
Yeah.
So if we look at gender norms in
Okay.
society, and
Okay.
they have changed drastically, and definitely in the aspect of women taking ownership of their bodies or their sexual health, we still live in a society where gender norms, men tend to dictate what happens in those types of situations.
So it's a power issue.
Oh, definitely a power issue.
Okay.
And
Either personal power, economic power.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And again, I am not saying that women don't have power.
We're not. No, you go ahead. I give you
Yes.
permission to speak in generalities.
I appreciate that. And so what tends to happen is you're dealing with a situation, if we look at, say, for instance, sexual health, you're dealing with a situation where men tend to have power based on gender norms. Also, a majority of times with the type of condoms that we use, men wear them.
Okay.
And so in that aspect of, if I'm also in a relationship that I think is monogamous, or it's just, me and another person, I'm probably less likely or less inclined to have my partner wear a condom. When it comes
Or partner
to,
say, I don't want to wear a condom.
yes, yeah, and that very well can happen. And so,
You don't feel as good with a condom.
And in certain settings or certain situations, we have to take into consideration the real life aspect of it. And so if
That's what I want to get to, is the real life aspect.
yes, and so if in that moment I'm in a relationship, and there is a power dynamic, and the person who tends to wear the condom does not want to wear one, and I am convinced that I am his only partner,
That's it.
yes, more than likely I may just be like, okay.
So does religion ever come into the discussion? People's faith or their beliefs, or how does the church impact or could impact that situation, but broader, those life outcomes and so forth?
I would say historically that the role that the church has played in not just communities or families, but black families, it's that level of trust. And being able to come to an entity that you trust that has historically had a track record of addressing health. There are a lot of faith-based initiatives out there currently being implemented. And so what we have discovered over time is doing faith-based initiatives or faith-based programs helps with the aspect of whether or not I trust this program, the vetting process of it.
But did you ever get into? I don't mean to cut you off.
Go
Sorry
ahead.
about that. I have a habit of doing that
That's
sometimes. People call me on it, and that's all right. Okay, I didn't finish my sentence.
I'm sitting at your table.
Okay, oftentimes these gender power issues are reinforced by scripture. Wife obey your husband. And the man is the head of the household. And that's verified both in the scripture, but also in church structures. Church structure. So this kind of dominance, is also not just economic, but oftentimes also has religious base to it or theological, base to it as well. And so, and I think also that, we talk about it, many of the habits, many of the taboos or stigma, especially related to HIV/AIDS, as well as sexuality, altogether, tends to silence people.
Yes.
As well as it influences their decisions that they may have. In your research, in your studies, in your interviews, does these kind of topics ever come up?
Yes, it does, and it's the struggle of do I go against the norm in claiming my level of independence, or
Now, speak as a woman.
okay, the best way I know how to
There
put
you
it.
go.
And I recently did.
I know you're a researcher. We all smart, but come on, just get
Yes.
down and talk to me.
The best way I know how to put it. And as crazy as it sounds, we did a presentation on it.
Okay.
Beyonce's Lemonade.
There you go.
Album.
Okay, there you go.
And if we look at that album, for me, it was like the black woman's anthem.
Okay,
Like I get to
okay.
love my man,
Okay.
and I get to be upset, and I get to claim what I'm going to do,
Okay.
and I get to take ownership of my life and
Okay.
my sexuality,
Okay.
and the fallout that comes from that. So if we think about her Super Bowl performance, or when Formation came out, she's anti-police. I'm not, large police union saying I'm not going to do security at her concerts. And so it's like, in one vein, you take ownership of your identity, yet there's a backlash from society.
It's consequences.
That
so when
takes on
Kanye
it.
just comes out and says something crazy like that, he doesn't get nearly the kickback, even when he says that black people had a choice, slavery was a choice.
Yeah, and it's interesting because same aspect. I thought about this the other day, but Kanye is still black.
Yeah.
And the fallout from what has happened to Kanye from that one statement pales in comparison to, fallout that we're expecting from people who've said worse that are not black.
So it's the issue is gender, but it's also race. That plays an important part.
Yes.
So talk about, I know, let's talk a little bit about your health justice project.
Sure.
And what do you hope to accomplish from that? And how does the issue of race, gender, and religion, which I think all are tremendous indicators of health, and health outcomes. So this is, and they all have justice related issues to them. So tell me how you mix all that up and what
Gotcha.
you've experienced.
This came about, honestly, because of Colin Kaepernick.
Okay, there you go. Thank you. Okay.
And when he decided to take a knee, I was going through, similar aspects where I felt like I wish I could, raise a voice, because
Okay.
a lot of times when we talk about social injustice, or we want people to pitch in, or help or fight for, they're brought in because of a personal cause, a personal connection. And if we only look at it in that aspect, then we can take the civil rights movement, for instance. This needed to be an overall call. It needed to start with those marginalized, but those that understood that this was not right had to join in order for a change to take place. And in looking at an NFL player who was vilified so much till the narrative was turned to he does not appreciate, veterans or the military, it was like, no, the man took a need to bring attention to a cause. And I thought about it. There are a lot of Colin Kaepernicks out there that don't work in the NFL, that didn't have a camera on them, that went through the same thing for speaking up, whether or not it was injustice towards them or others. And in doing the project, what I noticed is I started talking to people about their risk factors in HIV. It applied to other health issues, and people were telling the same story.
You have an example of one of those stories?
Sure. You know what? So I did the project in Jackson, Mississippi. And the only thing that I honestly really knew about Jackson, Mississippi was that I-20 drove through it.
My family is from there. We're from Epworth, Mississippi,
Yes.
Jackson, Clarksdale, all in there.
And I know of the history of Mississippi. I know what took place in Mississippi, but I've never got out of my car and spent time in Mississippi. And so when the Health Justice Project started, a friend of mine said, I think you should go and spend time in Mississippi and get a experience of it. And the funny thing was, I said to her, I would love to, because I also want to know, why do people love Jackson the way they love it? And the only way I know how to describe it, and I'm sure you probably feel this way, people love Jackson like it is a human being, like it is a person. And the loyalty to that city, the only thing I know how to describe it is how people feel about being from New York. And I went.
Or Houston, for that matter.
Well, yeah, that too. And as a transplant, it was, still a different aspect for me to understand. So I went, spent a week there, interviewed people, and based on their discussion of the city, I then explored additional items. And I wouldn't do it until it came up. And I figured it was coming, and I knew I had to be ready. And somebody finally mentioned Medgar Evers. And went to the house, did the tour, spent time in there. And somebody then mentioned, and I think it's called the Barnett Shoals. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
I think so.
Where primary water source in Jackson. And after being there for a week, and then also incorporating some additional research that I discovered on my own and exploring some things, pulling archival data, what I wanted to get to was how are health disparities created in Jackson. Like, Jackson, unfortunately, has become the new health disparities city example.
Really?
And what I discovered, the best way I know how to put it is, it all goes back to the water. And the level of love you have for a place, that's where you come from, that's where you were born, that's where you were raised. There's nothing wrong with it. Barnett Shoals is named after the most racist governor Mississippi has ever had. And over time, when disparities were created, whether or not through slavery, Jim Crow laws, the love that you have for your place is not a negative thing. You wanting to stay in Jackson is not a negative thing. However, when people know you're not leaving, and in essence, it's kind of difficult to fight that stigma. What happened in the 1700s, 1800s, even though by law, technically, it's not supposed to happen, it continues to happen based on the division that was already created. And the best way I know how to describe that reminder is, every time you do something related to water, you get it from the primary source that is named after the most racist governor in the state of Mississippi's history. So it's one of those where You love a place. There's nothing wrong with that. Loving a place in that setting, I think, in essence, places people in a disadvantage because you fight with what you have in that place, but you also love that place. And that's the best way I know how to describe how health disparities come about and are reinforced in Jackson, Mississippi.
That is really interesting.
Thank you.
Because I think that works both ways.
Mm-hmm.
In Memphis, where we started the Memphis model, there's a deep angst in that city about the assassination of Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
But that this angst has been translated into a positive thing, where people are trying to work for the aims to which Martin Luther King worked for. Now you're saying to me that you're not talking about the water quality or that the water's making people sick, but the internal struggle that they have with this love-hate relationship, causes a kind of a disparity or a psychological response to it that has physical outcomes.
Yes, and when we look at health disparities, in order for there to be a disparity or an inequity, there has to be a difference. And going back to using the Jackson example, there was a clear difference in how blacks were treated and the resources that they were given compared to whites. And this took place hundreds of years ago. And so over time, we think we have implemented things to close the gap.
Yeah, but they haven't closed the gap in education or the educational system there,
Nope.
which is one of the primary drivers, of health. They haven't changed. They haven't closed the gap in terms of poverty there, really. African. I know this was. I had your protege a little while ago.
Yes.
Talking about her home in Liberty. Well, you could make the same description in many of the places in Mississippi. With still going out to the outhouse. My grandmother, when I was down there, it wasn't that long ago. They still had outhouses. They had to go out to the back. We didn't have buckets, but we had an outhouse. In the back and so forth. And so that, and I thought primarily you might say, and I think that's irrelevant, but those social determinants, are intentional. They're not accidental. They're based upon policies that were put in place through white supremacy.
Yep.
So let's name it. White supremacy means you didn't get you ate hog maws and ham hocks, instead of pork shoulder, and so forth. If you got that at all, you've got the leftovers or the scraps.
Yes.
That was the most healthy thing. You ate and fried all your food and grease and seasoned it with salt just to make it taste better. And so my father was a sharecropper. So once they raised the crop, whatever's left over, you got from the company store.
Exactly.
And oftentimes it was not the healthy kind of things you find in HEB.
Exactly.
And so those kinds of things are results of historical racism and oppression. But what I'm hearing you talk about is internalized oppression.
Well, I wouldn't say internalized. What I would say is, so if we use the story that you just gave, in 2018, we can think that we now have policies that make it equal.
I don't think that.
Well, and I'm just saying in general, or it's not as bad as it used to be.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay.
People can think that may be true. However, if I started 5 steps behind, and given along the way all things are equal, nothing was ever done to bring me up to the 5 steps where I could be considered equal. And so
Exactly.
I feel like if we don't look at how things got started and then how we are living in a system where those policies still keep us divided, it won't ever get equal.
And I absolutely agree with that. And I think we can make a case for that, in any book and so forth. But what you said is something that's more interesting to me, and especially to the church, is the power of symbols.
Yes.
The power of symbols, because that water, what's the name of?
I think it's the Barnett Shaw.
The Barnett Shaw, that's a symbol, of all these other things that you're talking about.
Yes.
And those symbols have power. They have power to help shape our character, our hope or despair, even at a subconscious level, that works upon us. Andrew Antonovsky was a sociologist who really talked about stress, and he was a Jewish person who survived the Holocaust. And he was able to talk about how some folks who seem to be weak, they came out of the Holocaust all right, and some stronger folks who didn't make it, and he couldn't tell the difference between the two. He called salogenesis, or a sense of coherence.
Yes.
That they were able to make sense of their environment, and they had a narrative that they lived into that gave them hope. Now that had physical consequences. So if you're living out a narrative that you love but you hate at the same time, and there seems to be no hope because the dominant metaphor that controls your life is a negative metaphor, then that decreases, your own internal immune system and your peptides that are created. So that in itself helps to exasperate, the social determinants of health to a degree. Because I think, and I've seen places, where folks are living in these terrible conditions, but they still wind up healthy for some reason. And you have folks who live in conditions slightly better, but still ill. I was talking to Maisha earlier, and she talked about the difference between Liberty and the housing projects in Houston. Both of them have terrible poverty, one even more so, but yet they produce this beautiful young lady who goes to get her PhD and sees the need to help other people because she had a grandmama, that showed her an example of what really life was really all about, and that's giving her yourself. People, no matter what your is, that is healthy. Then you got another group of people who live in these communities with all kinds of resources, but they're in despair. They don't even reach out to the resources that they have. That is unhealthy. So it's not just your environment, it's also how you internalize it, and so forth. Wow. It's been exciting talking to you.
Thank you. Yes, this was very exciting.
Yeah. So we have a few minutes, just a couple seconds left. Anything else you want to say?
Sure. So I guess for more information about the project, or to learn more about the social determinants of health, the website for the project is thehealthjusticeproject.com. And I will be in Houston for a while.
Thank you very much. We sure appreciate you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.